This will be a lecture on Umberto Eco's essay, Ur-Fascism. One of the things which makes this essay particularly interesting is the fact that it is a mix of scholarly analysis and personal reflection. Eco, in case you're not familiar with him, is one of the most famous 20th century Italian scholars and novelists. On the novel side of things, he wrote The Name of the Rose, which was made into a fairly popular Hollywood movie starring Sean Connery. And he also wrote Foucault's Pendulum, was another bestseller of his. And in addition to writing novels, he also published in several scholarly fields, including philosophy, history, language, and cultural studies. So he has intellectual bona fides, but he also grew up in fascist Italy and witnessed firsthand what fascism was like. So this essay is a combination of both of those things. He's reflecting on his personal experiences as well as trying to give an analysis of what happened. Now, I'm going to focus in this lecture mostly on the analysis and set aside the personal experiences. If you read the essay, and you certainly should, you'll see that there's long sections of it that talk about various names of important people in Italian culture at the time. You probably won't recognize most of them, but it's not important to recognize most of them. You can understand what it is that he's talking about even if you don't recognize the names. Now, as for this approach, though, I want to acknowledge that there are both advantages and problems with this kind of first-person analysis. On the one hand, fascism isn't some sort of abstraction. It isn't just a theoretical concern. It isn't just a topic of historical reflection for Eco. It's concrete. It was an important part of his life when he was a child, and then, of course, the long scars of fascism ended up informing and influencing the history of his country as he grew up into an adult. So this is something that matters to him in a deep and personal way. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that no one person on the ground level, so to speak, can ever see the whole picture. Political systems are huge, countries are gigantic, and no one person's account of what it was like to grow up in fascist Italy can ever be exhaustive or comprehensive. And indeed, it might actually be misleading if it only shows one particular aspect of it. So part of what I think I like about this essay is that Eco manages sort of to combine the best of both worlds. He takes his personal experiences, but combines that with his scholarly acumen and uses it in a way that gives you sort of both sides. So you can see sort of the first-person perspective and the third-person perspective, and that gives it a unique kind of insight into its subject matter. Now, you might not be familiar with the prefix in the title, the prefix That's a German term, and it translates to something like primeval or primitive, something like that. So when Eco says that he's going to be talking about Ur-Fascism, what he means is he's trying to identify the root form of fascism, the core from which the various different incarnations of fascism branch out. Now, I said in my previous lecture in this series on Robert Paxton's 5 Stages of Fascism that fascism is very tricky to define and to pin down. And the reason why that is because it's modular. It takes different forms and different shapes depending on the particular circumstances that the fascists find themselves. In Eco's words, fascism was a fuzzy totalitarianism, a collage of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. You can sort of see his novelistic flair there when he writes like that, right? So, in other words, you should expect fascism to mold itself to the local contours. Again, it's worth remembering Mussolini was the first dictator to take power in 20th century Europe, and Hitler kind of followed his playbook. Hitler sort of saw what Mussolini did, and even though he was not a member of of Mussolini's fascist party, even though there is considerable differences between Mussolini and Hitler, Hitler liked what Mussolini was doing and was able to sort of adopt the general ideas that he was putting down, the general techniques to his own needs. So at the end of World War II, when we sort of started to look back on it, the one way of framing the competition was between freedom and fascism. The Axis powers was the fascist side, and the Allies were the freedom side. Now, obviously, that's pretty much of an oversimplification in a lot of ways. But my point isn't to endorse this way of framing the World War II. It's simply to say that this is a common way of thinking about it, right? That we've come to treat fascism as a shorthand for the villains in World War II. I'm not saying that's inappropriate, but the question I want to ask is, why is it that fascism, why is the label fascism end up being used in this way? George Orwell once said that if you wanted to define fascism with a single word, the best word for it would be bully. And that's an interesting way of thinking about it, right? Why is it that fascism has become a synonym for bully? Not that that word isn't appropriate, but the question is, why did this word in particular end up being used in this way? There was a whole bunch of other parties throughout Europe, in Spain and in France, that would retroactively be labeled as fascist parties, even though they weren't identical with the Italian fascist party. But something about those things, sort of seemed to echo what Mussolini was doing with his party, and so they got labeled with the same label that Mussolini's party got labeled. So why is this the case? Why is this the big one? Obviously one part of that explanation is the fact that Mussolini's Italy fascist party was one of the few that actually came to full power, came to full fruition. The parties in Spain and France and so forth never quite came to dominance. But again, the same thing was true of Hitler and the Nazi Party. While people do throw the label Nazi around quite a lot, usually they have a particular concrete ideology in mind. And that's why it perhaps makes sense to answer this question by distinguishing Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia from what Mussolini was doing. Now, Stalin's Communist Party was very much totalitarian. That is to say that the party and the government controlled all aspects of life. They had total and absolute authority over the lives of their citizens. Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia were totalitarian in this way. But as Eco frames it, Mussolini's Italy wasn't totalitarian because it lacked a substantive ideology. There was no sort of core principles that the fascists were committed to. They paid lip service to core principles. They said this is what we really believed, but quite frequently they would turn around within a couple of months or whatever and say, oh no, we believe something else completely different. Quoting Eco again here, Mussolini did not have any philosophy. He had only rhetoric. So this is why Eco thinks that fascism came to be this sort of catch-all term, because fascism is radically moldable. Now, even though Nazism is a kind of fascism and communism is not, for reasons I discussed in the previous lecture, it still is the case that you can sort of see that fascism will allow it to be the generic term. It'll allow it to be the umbrella catch-all term, precisely because that is the ideology, or the political concept, if you will, that allows it to transform itself into to Nazism or into any other kind of fascist politics. Now, in his essay, Eco outlines 14 different points of what he calls Ur-Fascism. But it's important to recognize that none of these things are the essence of fascism. None of them are necessary for fascism. Fascism, as Eco understands it, is more of a process or a function. It's a way of achieving and exercising political power rather than a political ideology, rather than something that has a concrete essence. And this creates problems for a lot of philosophers, especially if they're trained in the Western analytic tradition, because usually analytic philosophers look for what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. They want the heart of a thing, the Platonic form of a concept in order to talk about it meaningfully. This is sometimes called the fascist minimum, the hardcore, the essence of fascism that they're trying to sort of crack and understand. Eco thinks this kind of Platonic thinking, where you're looking for the essence, is a bit of a trap, and it ends up confusing us when we try to understand fascism. Rather than thinking of fascism in this Platonic way, we should think of it in the way that Ludwig Wittgenstein instructed us to think about concepts. That is to say, think of fascism more as a family of political systems rather than something that has an essence. So, at the different stages of the process and different particular locales and locations, different features are going to be more prominent. Some of these 14 points might be really important in some political areas, less important in others, but all of them bear this sort of family resemblance. That's Wittgenstein's term. So if you think about it, if you go to a family reunion, to maybe a family that you don't belong to, maybe it's just friends or something, you can sort of see that some people have the same eyes, and some people have the same ears, and some have the same nose and the same chin, but there is no sort of singular set that everyone has. It's not like everyone has the exact same nose. The nose is one aspect which is shared by some members, and the eyes are one aspect that are shared by others, and it sort of creates this sort of overlapping, fuzzy family resemblance. That's how you should understand fascism, according to Eco. You should understand it as a family of political strategies and political approaches to try and consolidate and exercise power. So one consequence of this, if we're looking forward, is that fascists in the 21st century will not look like Hitler or Mussolini. Now, obviously, yeah, there's some neo-Nazis out there who goose step and Sieg Heil and stuff like that. But that's not the people who Eco thinks we need to be concerned about. The people we need to be concerned about are going to be savvy enough to dress differently and talk differently, and in many ways even act differently. But the key thing is that they will engage in similar functions and similar political moves as they try to achieve and retain power. So, with this in mind, I want to outline the 14 points of Ur-Fascism as Eco understands them. Now, obviously, at 14 points, I can't go into detail on all of them. It would take a long time to sort of completely unpack them. And Eco himself actually doesn't say a whole lot about each of these. So I'm going to follow in that and just sort of give a brief overview of how I understand each of these 14 points. So the first point is what he calls the cult of tradition. This is the idea that you have some past that has been created in order to serve political purposes, and it might bear only a passing resemblance to events that actually happened. If you think, for example, about the way different sort of cultures mythologize their own past, like the famous story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, right? I cannot tell a lie. I think most of us understand that that story isn't really true, but the point isn't that it's an attempt to tell a literal truth. The point is that it's an attempt to get across an essence or an idea. Now, in fascist politics, those essences and ideas are taken to be more important than any kind of alleged factual truth. You have to believe in the mythology of your own tradition, of your own nation, more than you actually have to believe in the actual history. And you have to believe in that completely, hence the language of a cult. Point 2, irrationalism. This is where fascists will simultaneously endorse and reject ideas, sometimes even within the same breath. The one example that Eco gives is the idea of modernism. Modernism, according to fascists, on the one hand, is a terrible thing because it inspires decadence. It inspires people to be selfish and concerned with material good rather than spiritual renewal. They're concerned about their own happiness and their own well-being rather than the glory of the nation. So all those things, for all those reasons, modernism is bad. But at the same time, modernism is great because it creates the race car, right? The Italians love their race cars, and the Italian fascists thought race cars were just about the most awesome thing in the world. They also loved, of course, their war machines, which modernism made possible. So the dual-minded position on things like modernism is something that would be uncomfortable for most intellectually honest people. But under the irrationalist point of fascism, it's no problem at all. You don't even have to worry about it. You don't even have to try to justify it or rationalize it. Point 3, action for action's sake. This is sort of a shoot first and ask questions later approach. Thinking is for the weak. Don't strategize. Don't try to study or analyze. That's for intellectuals. That's for passive people. We need to be active. We need to move. Strike first. Strike hard. If I can steal a line from Karate Kid here, right? So it's very much a vigorous, strong, powerful, not an intellectual attitude that they're taking. Point 4, disagreement is treason. Everyone has to fall in line. Now, again, I did notice a second ago how they're willing to tolerate contradictions, but that's not the same as willing to tolerate dissent. You can tolerate it when Mussolini or when El Duce says two completely conflicting things, but if you turn around and say, well, I think we should try something different than what El Duce said, then you're engaged in treason. Even if you're meaning it constructively, even if you don't intend to be contradicting or saying you're smarter than the leader, doesn't matter. You can't disagree with it. You can't disagree with the party. You have to fall in line. You have to understand that they know best. Point number 5, fear of difference. There's a big streak of xenophobia that runs through fascism. This might be towards an ethnic group like the Jews. It might be towards a religious group also like the Jews or like Muslims perhaps. It might be against different nationalities. But there's anyone who doesn't fit the mold, anyone who isn't, and again, the best example of this would probably be the Nazis' ideal of the Aryan race, right? The further you fall away from the Aryan race, the less trustworthy you are. So there's a desire to sort of homogenize everything and a fear of anything that doesn't conform to that idea of what everything ought to be. Point 6, the appeal to a frustrated middle class. This is a point that Paxton makes quite a lot as well. The idea is that you had a middle class that was promised all sorts of great things in life. It's promised respect, promised good jobs, a strong economy, and for various reasons, those things have not materialized. And so, because you have this strong middle class, this working class that feels dejected and disillusioned, the fascists will often deliberately try to appeal to them to win them over and say, if you come join us, we will fight for your interests. We're not like those corrupt politicians or those rich elite people. We will make sure that you get what's coming to you. You will get what you deserve. And that's a pretty powerful sales pitch for a lot of people if they feel that the system has abandoned them. Point 7 is nationalism. Now, I want to distinguish your nationalism from just patriotism. Patriotism, loving your country, believing you want what's best for your country, fighting for your country. That is something that is you can find in just about every single culture everywhere you go. There's things to be said for it. There's things to be said against it. But nationalism is a much more extreme view. Nationalism, as I'm using the term here, means the notion that you get your identity and your sense of pride and dignity from being a part of the nation. You might not have much. You might not be rich, you might not be smart, but dang it, you are Italian, or you're American, or you're German, or you're French, or whatever. Nationalism can show up in any culture too, and it attempts to sort of replace all sense of meaning and purpose with this belonging to the collective. And what goes hand in hand with this idea of nationalism, of course, is the idea that there's some sort of nefarious they that is plotting against the nation. They may be insiders, they may be people who living within your nation and they're walking among you, or they may be foreign nationals over in other countries. But whoever it is, there always has to be someone to contrast you with. We belong to the nation. We're the good guys. Them over there, or even them in here, they're not like us, and they don't have the pride and the dignity that comes with being one of us. All right, point 8. Your enemies are simultaneously strong and weak. It's another kind of sort of contradictory notion, right? Whoever the enemies are, they have humiliated us. The reason why we are not ascendant, we're not in power now, is because they have stabbed us in the back. They have betrayed us. They have done something terrible to us. But don't worry, we are strong and we are destined to destroy them. They are weak, even though they beat us before, even though they set us up to fail in the past. Now we are in a position to reclaim what's rightfully ours. There's sort of this Schrodinger's cat kind of nature to it, right? Where they are simultaneously strong enough to have knocked us out of power for the moment, but so weak that we are destined to reclaim our place and crush them and destroy them. Along with this, point 9 is perpetual warfare. Quote George Orwell here: "The war is not meant to be won, it is meant to be continuous." The fascists have to sort of keep moving forward. It's kind of like the proverbial fish, right, who has to keep swimming, otherwise it's going to die. The war has to be continuous. It has to keep going forward, because if they won, they would lose their sense of momentum and purpose. They are here for conquest. They are here in order to conquer everything, because they are the great. They are the powerful. So war exists not in order to achieve particular military or even political goals. War is an end to itself. War is a force that gives us purpose. It's a force that gives us a sense of who we are. And as long as we are fighting, we are winning. Point 10, popular elitism. This is another sort of paradoxical kind of notion, right? How can the elites be popular, right? By the very nature, it can't be populous if it's everybody, and it can't be elite if it's only a few. So it's an attempt to subvert the idea of elitism entirely. The so-called elites, the rich, the powerful, the intellectuals, whatever, they call themselves elites, but they're not really elite. We are elite. The people are elite. The working class, all of us, we are the true elites. We're truly better than they are. They only think they're elite. They only have power, again, because usually of some convoluted conspiracy or something like that. But in truth, it is us. It is the people who are truly the best, who are truly glorious. And those so-called elites need to be taken down a few pegs. Point 11, the cult of heroism. Again, this is something that Eco talks about in the very beginning of his essay, where he talks about being educated in fascist schools when he was a boy. There's this idea that everyone has to have this heroic personal narrative, that they're part of a glorious struggle, and they must fight and they must die for their country. And it is better to die fighting for the valor of your nation than it is to live a long life and die in bed when you're 90. That's a coward's death. Dying on the the battlefield is a hero's death. It's this idea of elevating above all else, this idea of heroism, this idea of willing to fight and die, not for your own sake, but for the sake of your nation and your people. It's a very powerful, motivating way of building a society that has the psychology necessary for eternal conquest and war. Point 12, machismo, which is this, it's an Italian word, a phrase that it's been kind of popular nowadays, which is somewhat similar to it, might be something like toxic masculinity. Although, of course, the fascists don't think it's toxic. They just think it's a particular breed of masculinity. Machismo is manly men doing manly things, strong things, lifting weights and climbing mountains and running marathons, doing things that involve power and strength and never showing weakness, never crying, never showing your emotions. There's a strong undercurrent of sexual anxiety along with all of this. Often, of course, it's not uncommon to find homophobia and effeminate men to be particularly threatening because they don't live up to this idea of machismo. So this strong masculine energy running through not just the culture, but also the politics and the broader political structures as well. Point 13, selective populism. This is another kind of contradiction in which the people are everything, but the person is nothing. Individual rights, someone who insists on their rights against the people is someone who is selfish. Someone who is putting themselves before their brothers and sisters, before their fellow Italians or Germans or what have you. In order to be one of the elite, you have to be willing to subsume yourself for the greater good. You are powerful and strong as long as you are part of the people, but the moment you become a person, an individual, well then that no longer works. So you're no longer one of us, you're no longer a part of the team. 14th and final point, newspeak. This is a term that Eco draws deliberately from George Orwell, and I say it in terms of just keeping your words simple. All these intellectuals that try to give you this deep vocabularies, these tools for analyzing and thinking critically and understanding nuance and so forth, that's dangerous. All you need is simple, straightforward common sense. The power to think for yourself, the power to analyze and to understand difficult concepts, that's the kind of stuff that creates independent thinkers, not members of a party. So in order to break people down as individuals, in order to break down their capacity to think for themselves and to critically analyze things, you diminish their vocabulary. You deliberately make it such that it's hard for them to talk about nuanced and sophisticated things. Okay, all right, so 14 points, that's a lot of points. It's a lot to cover. I want to try to kind of boil down what I've been talking about both for this lecture and the previous lecture on Paxton to a couple of common themes. So if you want to sort of, if you will, a cheat sheet on fascism, not the essence of fascism, but some of the common themes that we've been talking about in both these two lectures, you can boil them down this way. First off, populism and authoritarianism. You need to understand that fascism is a mass movement. It is deliberately attempting to say that the people are in charge, the people have the power. Now, it doesn't happen through democratic elections, of course. Those are shams, those are fraud. It comes through the mobilization of people in the street. They come together for huge rallies, and everyone is clearly chanting, and everyone is moving and marching in lockstep, and clearly the people are of one mind here. And you have to mobilize those people against that elite, against the other, against the people who are keeping your people down, the people who are responsible for the failures of this nation, the people who have done who have crippled your nation and made it impossible to thrive. Those people need to be overthrown, and only by surrendering to the authority of the party, the authority of the state, can we ever hope to possibly reclaim the glory of our nation. That brings us to the second point: the combination of nationalism and the mythic past. Fascists always sort of try to promise to restore a nation to a lost greatness, and usually that greatness is non-existent. The number of cultural permutations that Italy went through between the fall of the Roman Empire and 20th century Italy were so many. You're talking literally about hundreds and hundreds of years there, and the reconstructed vision of ancient Rome was largely fictional. It was largely recreated to serve political purposes. So this notion of the mythic past, again, being more important than the actual past, giving us a sense of purpose and identity and direction, and requiring us all to surrender ourselves to the party and to the nation. Next point, violence and victimhood. There's a great quote here that I think really captures this spirit well from Mussolini. Someone once asked him, what is the fascist party's program, right? What's its platform? What does it want to achieve? And Mussolini snapped back to this person, to break the bones of the Democrats. Again, that's small d Democrats there, right? People who believed in elections, people who believed in liberal democracy that he's talking about. Those people have betrayed us. They sold us a bill of goods. They told us that we were going to have power and authority and voices in politics, but they lied to us. So we are going to break their bones. And I think it's quite clear here, Mussolini wasn't being figurative here. He isn't talking about breaking their political structure or something like that. He's talking about literally breaking the bones of the Democrats. He's talking about violence in the streets. That is not only justified, that is glorious, that is wonderful. That is the reason why the party exists, he's saying in this quote, right? And why does it exist? Because we've been victimized. Because the Democrats have betrayed us. Because the politicians have betrayed us. The elites have betrayed us. The intellectuals have betrayed us. All of those people need to be dealt with. We need to break their bones. This is a very common theme in a lot of fascist rhetoric. Okay, fourth and final pair of themes. Propaganda and what Jason Stanley calls unreality. It's more important for fascist rhetoric to feel good than it is to be true or consistent. If you go up to a fascist true believer and you start to say, but you're contradicting yourself, or that story that he just told isn't true, or that's a lie, you're missing the point. They don't care about any of these things. The fascists are not required, nor do they particularly value the statements that their leaders make of being true or logically consistent. The point just is that they feel right. They resonate. They give you a sense of pride and they make you feel good. That's what matters. That's where the value comes from. A phrase here, which is the title of a book on Russia, is very apt here. Nothing is true and everything is possible. Right? That's a great way of capturing this notion of propaganda and unreality. Right? You're not committed to any particular story, any particular narrative about the truth. Anything can be possible. Anything can be the truth as long as it gives you pride, as long as it makes you feel good, as long as it makes you feel strong, as long as it brings glory to the nation. This is a very powerful way of rallying people to your banners and allowing them to surrender not only their lives but their very identity to the fascist movement. It is an incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous tenet in fascist political psychology.